I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and in this lecture we're going to discuss and look at Chapter 9 of Christopher Moore's book, The Mediation Process. The title of Chapter 9 is Defining Issues and Setting an Agenda. And what I'm going to do is briefly go through what Moore discusses in this chapter on strategies, different methods, and methodologies where we can define issues and set an agenda within our mediation. Personally, as a Florida State Supreme Court certified county mediator, I extensively use Moore in the practice of mediation. My students use Moore's text in learning to understand how to mediate, and I think some of the suggestions that Moore gives in the text are actually invaluable. So without further ado, let's get into sort of the heart of the topic. I'm not going to go blow by blow through the chapter. What I'm going to do is give sort of a general synopsis of what Moore is discussing in this section. All right, so this is defining issues and setting agenda. Okay. All right, so the first thing that Moore discusses that's important are the three critical tasks negotiators and mediators must accomplish. So there's three critical tasks that mediators must accomplish. The first task that mediators have to accomplish is to identify broad topics or areas or concerns of the party. So the first thing that we have to do is generally identify what are the areas of interest, right? The broad topics or broad areas of interest. All right, so what are the parties interested in? So we'll have, let's say, party A and party B. And party A is interested in topic X, and party B is interested in discussing topic Y, and it is the mediator's responsibility to sort of bridge the gap between these two topics. Though that's not explicitly stated in Moore's opening suggestions, in his opening claims, that's what's to be understood. The second thing that second critical task that mediators must be able to do is to agree on subtopics of interest, right? So we need to address broad topics, but a little bit more precisely subtopics of interest. And that's interest to the parties. And then lastly, the last claim is to determine the sequence of how these topics are going to be discussed, right? And later in this section, he talks about agenda setting and what mediators need to do in order to have a sequential outline for how their mediation process unfolds so that parties can feel comfortable and have a clear understanding of what the expectations are. All right, so the last is determining the sequence of discussion. So sequence. Okay, so the first is broad areas of interest. The second is to create subtopics of interest. What are other subtopics that you might want to discuss in this mediation? The way that I would say it as a mediator are, hey, Mary, what are some of the general issues that you want to discuss in this mediation? And she would tell me some of the general issues. That would cover sort of number one. And then I might say, well, Mary, concerning the thing that you told me before, is there anything specific about that area of interest that you want to delve a little bit deeper into? And that will cover two. And then lastly, what I would tell her is I would assure her sort of the sequence of discussion. Okay, thank you for sharing that with me, Mary. This is all hypothetical, of course. Thank you for sharing that with me, Mary. What I'm going to do now is, first I'm going to address some of your general concerns, and then what we're going to do is I'm going to let you guys sort of storytell and explain to me how these issues affected your life. How did it affect your relationship? Because in the process of mediation, what we're always doing is we're trying to reconstruct this relationship that was being that's developed. Now we have to make sure that we at all times safeguard the self-determination of each party, and that we in no way suggest alternatives for our parties, but what we do is we facilitate and we create an environment wherein the parties feel confident and comfortable in order to exercise their self-determination. And I think what Moore has given us is sort of a guideline in order to get that done. Some of the things, and as I said, I'm not going to go through all of Moore specifically. I'm jumping ahead to value-based conflict. I thought that was a very important point in Moore's discussion, and I'm going to tie that into this concept of resolving the tension between party A and party B. With respect to the idea of value-based conflict, and I'll write this down. But the idea of value-based conflict is sort of governed, if you will, by multiple ideas, but two key ideas that Moore brings up that I thought was of importance are notions or conceptions of guilt or innocence. Anytime there are conceptions of guilt or innocence that a party, hold on one second, I'm taping, sorry. Anytime there are conceptions of guilt or innocence that are introduced by the parties in mediation, immediately the mediator should recognize that we're going to be dealing as mediators with ideas of value-based conflict. Some of the problems, now Moore doesn't go into too much detail defining some of the problems and the conflicts with mediating value-based conflict. So just to be clear, there's a conflict between parties. So we have a conception of guilt, let's say. And that guilt might be, let's say, infidelity, right? So you have party A and you have party B. And there might be conceptions of guilt, right? This party might feel guilty for having done something. This party might feel as if the guilt that the other person is feeling, the level of guilt that I'm feeling, might in some sense have to do with his or her connection to me, my lack of trust in this individual. So what ends up happening is we end up talking about notions of trust, we talk about notions of innocence, obviously we're talking about guilt, faith, and so on and so on and so on. When parties introduce these ideas during the mediation process, what they're letting you know is that the conflict resolves primarily around conceptions which are value-based. And seeing that these are based in value, these mediation processes tend to have a lot of emphasis placed on the principle of the act. It's based on principle. You should not have done X. He should not have done Y. She ought to do this. He ought to do that. So what you'll hear are, you'll usually hear should, or you'll hear ought. These are indications that either of these parties, either party A or party B, is making an appeal. So that anytime a party introduces the idea of he should do or she should do X, or he ought to do X or he ought to do Y, there's making appeal. So anytime you see these terms, and these terms, this is not in Moore. Moore doesn't discuss this, but technically speaking, these terms are known as normative terms. These are known as normative terms. Anytime normative terms are being introduced by a party in a mediation, these terms signify, they represent an appeal. An appeal is being made. An appeal to whom? Well, appeal to a value system, an appeal to a norm, an appeal to some outside third party. There might be a disagreement on what this appeal is, and if a mediator, a person sort of mitigating this dispute, can identify that, it can help facilitate an easier mediation.